This is Mark Locks, Extension Weed Scientist with the Ohio State University, and this video covers noxious weed issues, including the basics of the noxious weed law, why weeds are on the list, some of the enforcement issues that come up, and then a little bit of general knowledge about some of the key weeds that we deal with a lot with the noxious weed law. We have a great bulletin on this from Peggy Hall, who's in our farm office department, farmoffice.osu.edu, and it covers a lot of what I'm going to talk about here in a couple pages. And so, if you're interested in or have a need to use a noxious weed law, if you're curious about, how it might apply to a given situation, this can get you started. It's got a list of the weeds and then responsibilities for different types of people in different areas, and then kind of what the process is for private land. From that bulletin, we define noxious weeds as plants that can injure agricultural crops and livestock due to their invasiveness, their toxicity, or other harmful characteristics, and can also negatively impact people and ecosystems. So it's a pretty broad definition, and it covers a lot of different areas and reasons why weeds might be on the law. Reasons that we designate weeds as noxious, as far as I can tell from looking at the weed and just generally seeing how these weeds are a problem, is they're invasive. So they impact natural areas, wetlands, or prairie, or other areas. We have a separate invasive weed list for the state, but there's no statute associated with that, so there's no enforcement on that. So some of the key invasives are on this list, the noxious weed list, where there is the possibility of enforcement. Problem in crops, so there they reduce crop yield, or they increase expenses, or they're just generally hard to handle, or they have resistance issues, or they tend to proliferate very rapidly. Poisonous to livestock, or there are human health issues associated with it, and then a whole sort of category of safety, drainage, aesthetic issues. A lot of these weeds show up just in unmanaged areas like roadsides, fence rows, places like that sort of no one has responsibility for, and in some cases those can be issues. But there are specific responsibilities for the railroads and roadside people managing that to take care of these, so that they don't cause some of these issues. In some cases, they have weeds that can take over an abandoned area and be a nuisance. An example of that is vineyards, which grape vines are on the list. Cultivated grapevines if they're abandoned. Federal agency rules, for example, Canada thistle's on the list, so we can mow it earlier and set aside crep type situations and prevent it from going to seed. And you need to have the noxious weed list to bypass federal agency rules about how those types of areas are managed. Or maybe they're prone to escape from private gardens and landscapes, which sort of again goes in the invasive category. They obviously have some other issue associated with them if we care that they escaped from these areas. So here's our list. It's actually a relatively large list compared to a lot of states. The survey that we did on this, some states have 6 or 8 weeds on their list. There's a whole smattering here. Some you recognize, some you may not. Some of these are on here just because they're a problem in other parts of the country and we don't need them here. And so, the goal is to make sure that they don't get started. But you see a lot of the common weeds that we deal with or have dealt with: shattercane, Johnson grass, Canada thistle, poison hemlock, crestleaf groundsel, weeds like that. You see some that aren't quite so common, or that we really don't have here very much, like kudzu. I know of I think 1 or 2 areas where we have kudzu in the state. Some of these are problems further west: Russian knapweed, leafy spurge, that we really don't have here, but we don't want here either. So it's kind of a variety of weeds on the list. And as far as I can tell, I kind of went through and tried to figure out, okay, why are these weeds on the list? And it's not possible. The parts of the list predate my time here at Ohio State, and then in other cases, weeds have been added with my input, and in some cases added without my input. In 2018, for example, we added 13 species and removed 3. I suggested we remove 3 just because I didn't see the problem with them, and they were basically, almost everywhere in the state anyway, so it probably didn't matter. But as far as I can tell, and there's some overlap between these categories in some cases, we've got weeds that are invasive or degrade native landscapes. You've got poisonous or human health issues. They're a problem in crop production or pasture, and that's a big category. And that's one of the biggest reasons for the law to be used, is that it eventually becomes a problem in crop production or pasture. 3 of them escape from private gardens and landscapes. 9 of them, as far as I can tell, are a problem in other areas, regions, and we don't want them here. And then 7 are colonizers of abandoned places and roadsides and things like that. And they're a problem there, and that's why they're on the list. We do have a bulletin. It's free. It's on iTunes or Google Play. It's an ebook or an iBook. And this was done when we had 21 noxious weeds, but it's free. It's helpful in identification. And so you can download that, use it on a tablet or laptop or whatever you want to do. I'm just pulling a few out of here to show you the how this looks in terms of being helpful in ID. So you can see the spread here on Crest Safe Groundswell, for example, and you can see some photos. You click on those, they'll blow up, and then you can see down at the bottom left, bottom right, on the bottom of that second page, you've got a smaller photos down there that if you click on those, you'll see a larger photo. So it gives you some ID characteristics. Crest Safe Groundswell is a winter annual that is poisonous to livestock, and that's really why it's on the list. It infests all kinds of no-till corn and soybean production fields and is usually taken out with burn down herbicides in the spring or dies on its own. And it's not really an issue there because it's not going to poison anything, but it is an issue in anywhere that, if it's a pasture. It tends to be a problem in first year hay a lot. If hay is seeded, for example, in August, a hay field, and then this comes up and competes with that in the fall as it's emerging, and then you'll come back and see that next year. And it tends to get ahead of people. They don't scout, and then you come back in the spring, and by the time you realize it's there, you've got large plants with these yellow flowers, and you can't control them. And you have areas of the field you have to either discard the hay or not, or just mow it and not bale it. Or whatever. So that's the issue with that. It's pretty easily controlled with fall herbicide applications. In spring, it's just generally tougher to control. Mare's tail, which of course is ubiquitous in the state. I kind of wonder why it's really even on the list. It does colonize waste places. It's one of those first weeds you're going to see. I mean, when you start looking for mare's tail, it's literally everywhere, and it can grow out of concrete, and it's just really easy to find. But one of the things it does is colonize abandoned areas. It's one of the first colonizers in there in a lot of cases. And so, having it on the list enables you to be able to go into some of those areas if you're a municipality or whatever and take care of some of that. I've never actually heard of anyone using the noxious weed list law when they've seen mare's tail in somebody else's crop field, because we've over time just had a lot of crop fields at various times that have had heavy infestations of mare's tail. But it is on the list. It does produce a couple 100,000 seeds per plant, and they blow around. So, one of the things to think about here is if you have a neighbor that has just a lot of mare's tail they're letting go, it's going to go to seed and have the possibility to infest your areas. Johnson grass, which was one of the, I think, first weeds on the list, along with shattercane, and that's because Johnson grass used to be really almost impossible to control in cropland. Now we've had a lot of good controls of this in cropland for years, but it does cause problems in roadsides and some places like that, and it can creep into crop fields from those areas. And so, municipalities and roadsides, where I hear about Johnson grass is somebody saying, well, the township or someone's not doing the right thing on the roadside, so that's serving as a source of infestation for crop fields. Grapevines, plants that sort of got away from us are a problem. Grapevines are on the list, and it specifies cultivated grapevines or domestic grapevines that have been abandoned and are at least in a number of 100 or more. So basically, at some point, there was an abandoned vineyard somewhere where somebody decided this was an eyesore, I guess, and that's on the list. That's not to be confused with wild grape, which is what that photo is showing on that whole spread on the left. That photo on the bottom right, wild grape's a vine that overtakes, roads or wooded areas and is really problematic, but actually is not on the noxious weed list. Japanese knotweed, which was an ornamental that got away and is just a really nasty invasive weed in places like Coshocton County and some other areas on the east side of the state. It has taken over whole swaths of land, and it's just really difficult to control, also known as Japanese bamboo. Canada thistle, which again we've had better controls for Canada thistle in my 35 years at Ohio State. The controls certainly got better when we had the implementation of Roundup Ready beans. It has been making a little bit of a comeback the past couple years, but the reason that Canada thistle is on the list, as I indicated before, is because it goes to seed in end of June, left undisturbed, and the seed blow around. And so by putting it on the list in those areas where it likes to infest, crep, and some other areas like that, The idea is that you can mow it early enough to keep it from going to seed, and by having it on the list, you can bypass the federal regulations. There's several weeds in the parsley family, starting with wild carrot, which I think we just took off the list. Wild carrot is at least is the most innocuous of all these. All these have some odor and some possibly some skin irritation, with the exception of carrot, really. Carrot's a biennial crossing over into a perennial, and all these like non-managed, unmanaged areas. Wild parsnip is one you see a lot on roadsides. If you're driving along one of the interstates and some other roads, and you've got sort of that swath of ground between the interstate and where a fence is, that's maintained in theory by the highway department, you can see a lot of wild parsnip in there. The two that are just more problematic are poison hemlock and giant hogweed because of their toxicity. Now, giant hogweed is just really nasty. This is the one that you can touch and you get sap on you, sun hits it, you get instant blistering. Just a really nasty weed. I've only seen it or found it in a couple places in Ohio. A homeowner had it at one point, and then there was a little bit in Ashtabula County. So this is one we're just really trying to keep out, and so far it hasn't really come in, but it's really nasty. It's got a huge flower. There's another one, cow parsnip, in this family that looks like this somewhat, but isn't on the list, but it's way shorter. This weed can get 6-8 feet tall with a dinner platter size flower on it. Poison hemlock is also poisonous, but you really have to ingest it. You can, in an instance where you're mowing it and you breathe in what you're mowing, if you're mowing a bunch of poison hemlock, that's a problem. But really, aside from that, you have to ingest it, although people can have, it varies by person, but they can have some skin irritation from this. But poison hemlock is an example of a weed that it's on the noxious weed list because we don't want it in pastures. We don't want it places where it can affect humans or, poison livestock. It's probably the last thing livestock would actually ever eat. Having said that, poison hemlock is everywhere, especially in the southern two-thirds of the state, but also in the northern third as well now. And it really, it's pretty evident to me that, the noxious weed law is rarely being used for this, if at all. And so it remains a big problem, but it really hasn't caused poisonings in spite of the bad reputation that it has. Goals of a noxious weed management program: you're trying to prevent establishment from outside sources, so weeds that are demonstrated problems in other states or areas. If you see, the idea of having them on the list is if that does get started, and some of these get started like on railroad areas because railroads spread seed along their tracks. Bird seed, for example, can have, some of this in it from other areas, and things like that. Preventing spread within the state, so if we have something that's got little bit of establishment, but you really don't want it to spread. You're trying to make sure you keep it from going to seed. Prevention or removal when small. And again, when you have livestock or human health issues, or livestock poisoning or human health issues, your problem is when you get plants large enough that they're having that type of impact. And so ideally these you're controlling when they're small before they have the ability to have that kind of impact. And then for some, it's the management is frequent enough to control to minimize issues. And so again, we've got all these weeds that like to be in unmanaged areas, and you're trying to, in a lot of these areas, perform control often enough so that you're going to have some times when they get a little bit of size to them because you just can't keep them necessarily constantly controlled, but try to frequent enough control to minimize issues and keep the size small and keep them from going to seed and spreading. And these are some examples of this, what I'm talking about for those type of weeds. This is out a bike path, the Camp Chase Trail that runs out the west side of Columbus. And there's various areas along here. There's a railroad, so you've got an area right next to the railroad that's maintained. And then you've got some other areas that obviously aren't mowed. The idea is, they're not going to mow these areas. They want to have some type of vegetation there. And so you can see mare's tail on the left. You've got Johnson grass in that. You've got mare's tail in the middle. You've got a wild carrot and some other weeds on the right. There's poison hemlock in that area. There's some Canada thistle, and then there's a whole slug of mare's tail. That's a rail. I haven't figured out that rail line. I don't think it's abandoned, but it doesn't get a lot of use through there. Yeah. I think sometimes, and you have situations like with the mare's tail here. But mare's tail grows out of concrete. I think we had it growing out of an engine, out of a car that was sitting in the parking lot here at OSU outside our building for a while. It looked like it was growing right out of the engine. So really amazing weed. And then the two weeds that have really driven more attention to the noxious weed law in the past probably 4 to 6 years. than anything else that's on there are palmer amaranth and water hemp, which are weeds that are becoming a problem in cropland. Water hemp is pretty well spread around the state now. Both of these produce 500,000 to a million seeds per plant. They've got multiple herbicide resistance issues. They have long periods of emergence, so they require complex control programs, and if you don't implement them right or hit the wrong combination of herbicide and resistance, you have big problems, and they can also increase their population really fast. So water hemp is pretty spread around the state pretty well now. Palmer amaranth we really have largely kept out. We've had some introductions of it, but it really hasn't gotten a good foothold. Both of these are in the pigweed family, so extremely small seed and lots of it. Palmer amaranth is the reason that the Weed Science Society of America eventually decided, okay, we need to accept that, the term superweed is going to be used. We'll come up with a definition, even though there are a lot of other weeds like dandelion, for example, that we consider superweeds. But I mean, just an amazing plant when it goes full seed, and all of those sprigs on that one on the left are all loaded with seed, and on the right, my colleague is holding a seed head that's probably 3 feet long, just packed with seed. So really amazing plant. It has the potential to do a lot of damage. One of the problems with both of these is you can go from having a few plants to a pretty major problem within a year or two because of that seed production. And so here's an example of a field I was in back in 2016 where, I mean, you can't hardly see the soybeans in here. The grower's comment was we didn't have this wheat last year, and we figured out that finally it had been corn the year before, and yeah, they had to have some in there, but really not like this. It just shows you how fast the population can increase. So obviously, when you have a neighbor, you have something going on in the neighborhood with this going to seed, and somebody's not taking it seriously, that's a place where, I know people have tried to use the noxious weed law in that case to kind of shut that down so it doesn't impact the whole neighborhood. This is the weed that's caused some fields to be mowed down. I've heard over time of some other fields through threat of the noxious weed law. In some cases, some organic fields, it just got out of hand and neighbors came and said, you're going to have to mow that down. That's just hearsay for me. And anecdotal, but I was involved in several cases where Palmer amaranth got out of hand and the soybean field was actually mowed to try to prevent a lot of it from going to seed. What's interesting about that is you can see what this field looked like immediately after mowing, and then of course what this plant does is reroot at all the nodes. When you put it down on the soil there, it can reroot. And if you don't follow up with tillage or herbicides or whatever, what you have is what's on the right there, where it just basically retakes off again and you still have seed. Not as much, but still comes back. So it's the weed. There have been some other cases where the threat of use of the noxious weed law, or in one case use of the noxious weed law was for Palmer amaranth was caused someone to have to mow it down, or at least mow down part of a field. So the way the noxious weed law works for private land is that if, for example, you have a neighbor on their cropland or other land that's not controlling noxious weed laws and you think this is a concern, you would notify the township trustees in writing that noxious weeds exist on a parcel in the township. They have to notify the owner or other person responsible for the infested land about the noxious weed laws. And at some point here, the trustees have backup from the county prosecutor's office, and so one of the cases I was involved in, the assistant prosecutor was involved, and I was working with her in that case. So this can be a time-consuming step. I think the county prosecutors get involved in how that letter is going to be written and what that contact looks like, and in some cases they've dragged their feet to the point that weeds have gone to seed. Within 5 days after the person managing that land gets a letter, they have to either destroy weeds or show trustees why there's no need to do so. And if they don't, trustees can cause the weeds to be cut or destroyed, and then auditor can assess cost on property taxes. So there's multiple places here where this can break down. Again, I've had cases where the county prosecutor's office, according to one person who tried to implement the law, basically never did what they were supposed to help the trustees, and so nothing happened. In another case, the person got the letter and decided not to do anything, and the trustees were unwilling to do what needed to be done there. One of the issues there is if the trustees decide to mow down a crop field, that's a big deal. So you can see why they would be reluctant to do some of that. So it doesn't, if everything goes the way it's supposed to on a timely basis, everyone does what they're supposed to, the law works, but there are reasons why it doesn't. This is different than the line fence law. So in this case, landowners must cut all noxious weeds, brush, briars, and thistles within 4 feet of a fence and in corners of a property line fence. And if they don't, it's sort of the same procedure, but you basically notify them, hey, you're not doing this and you need to. And then if they don't, you can notify township trustees who would look and see whether there's a problem and a reason to remove it. And then I assume this doesn't say specifically, but tell that person they need to, and if they don't, then they can hire somebody to do it and put it on the property tax bill. The noxious weed law applies to roadways and railroads, so it's a little bit different. They have another principle that guides them, or another law. It's the responsibility of the company superintendent or manager of toll roads and railroads to take care of this, and public roadways to be responsibility of state highway department or counties or townships or municipalities or whatever. And they have to cut or destroy. It's not just noxious weeds. Noxious weeds, brush, burrs, and vines growing on roads and streets and the road right away. It's a safety issue, among other things. So it's not just noxious weeds. They have a responsibility to keep those areas free of vegetation. And per that statute, vegetation must be cut or mowed between June 1st and 20th, and then again between August 1st and 20th, and then in September if needed. And I don't know how closely that's followed, and then of course also whenever necessary to prevent or eliminate a safety hazard. On certain public lands, after being made aware of the issue, township trustees must notify county extension educator, who then forms a committee with the landowner, the SW, Soil and Water Conservation District supervisor for whatever reason, and then whoever is managing that, the representative of them. They meet, consider ways to deal with the problem, and report back to the trustees. Following that, I'm not sure what that all means in terms of what has to be done, or how the trustees are involved with that. We did a survey on noxious weed issues with a lot of our extension at county educators, and then we actually sent it out to university extension weed scientists, and so we had 60 responses total, mostly from our county educators. Had a nice response on this, and it gives a really nice picture of what the issues are with noxious weeds in the state of Ohio. And mixed in with this, because we couldn't separate it, were some of the information from other states as well. Situations where noxious weeds occur most often, not use of the law, but just where are they seen most often. And as you'd predict, along roadways and roadway ditches and things like that, in areas that aren't kept free of vegetation all year necessarily, or there's control implemented periodically, and you can see them there. Obviously, if you have land that's back on the other side of a woods or something and no one can see, and you have noxious weeds, no one really sees it or cares. But you have a lot of areas like this where they're a problem, and they like to grow there. Public parklands. So you see 39 responses for along roadways, roadway ditches. Public parklands 5, road crops 3, fence rows 5. So this, relatively speaking, where people see noxious weeds the most is in roadways, roadway ditches, and things like that. But where they cause the most problems is not necessarily there. Key weed drivers, and again, you got some info from other states: poison hemlock, Johnson grass, Canada thistle, purple loosestrife, which likes to be in aquatic areas, and then kudzu in other areas of the country that have kudzu. Weeds that cause human health problems, because that's always going to be a major concern. Invasives that degrade the quality of native landscapes, because that's also very evident when you have someone managing a native landscape and you have invasive weeds. That's someone's on top of that and watching that. Weeds that spread easily: Palmer amaranth, water hemp, and horseweed. Again, this is from the survey that we conducted, so this is the impressions of our county educators. And then weeds easily seen in road ditches. So from our county educator's perspective, are you aware of the noxious weed law and how it works? Mostly yes. Do you provide educational resources? Mostly yes. Does it target specific weeds or situations? Mostly yes. How's clientele awareness about the noxious weed law? Generally low. And I think it's one of those things that unless you've had cause to really utilize the law because you've seen a problem in your area, then you probably don't have much awareness of it. What type of situations are our county educators providing education and resources for? A lot of it's been Palmer amaranth, water hemp, horseweed, mare's tail, poison hemlock, crestleaf groundsel, some of the main things that are really evident and we know cause problems with crops or with livestock, human health. General awareness of species that need to be controlled, and that's their education. In building lot areas, trying to resolve complaints or disputes between landowners. Involvement where the township trustees are declined to be involved or are reluctant to be involved, so we're trying to educate people on that. Providing information on an individual basis, and then providing information on who's responsible for managing weeds in certain areas and has a responsibility for the law. County educators, have you been involved directly with use of the noxious weed law? About half have, yes. And have there been problems? And mostly say, about 2/3 say yes. There have been problems with implementation. So this is a little different than the list I just showed, which is where we're most likely to see noxious weeds. This is where the law was most used. Ag-related problems like water hemp and palmer is the majority of this, followed by protection from invasive weeds and poisonous plants in pastures. And then other miscellaneous situations. So while you don't necessarily think of ag as where you would see noxious weeds the most readily, those are instances where someone needed to do something and the law was used. Other situations, private residences, for example, somebody had giant hogweed growing in their garden. Community members concerned about weeds near a property value. Neighbors complaining about other neighbors. Township, county not controlling in right-of-ways. I hear about that a fair amount. As I mentioned earlier, I think roadsides and right-of-ways that people can see where there's a responsibility of anyone from ODOT to a township or a county, and they're not controlling them yet there. Ditch maintenance, woodlands. Problems with implementation. Township trustees or other local authorities unaware of the law. So you could come to the township trustees in this case and they haven't had to use the law, aren't aware of how it works or what it does. Trustees unwilling or unable to enforce the law or failing to act in a timely manner. Some of that's not their fault. I think, again, some of that comes back to the county prosecutor, but I really don't have enough information to say who's doing what there. But, in some cases, there's probably a political thing coming in here where it's just not an easy situation to deal with necessarily, and so some cases it's probably easier just not to deal with it. Individuals or county, state not following the law or using ineffective methods for control. Law is not enforced. We don't know who would enforce it based on where noxious weeds are happening. Here's one that's come up several times. Late season problems in ag fields where maybe in August, for example, you find water hemp or palmer in neighbors' fields and you don't really want to have to deal with that and don't want the seed coming into your field. How to get the whole law implemented and make all that work and destroy the weeds in time to prevent seed. And that's been an issue. There's been a number of cases I've seen where the plants actually went to seed by the time anyone did what they were supposed to. And then compensation to farmers who are required to destroy crops. My opinion on this is there's probably not any compensation. I haven't seen anything about compensation anywhere in the law, but that's certainly one of the issues from a township trustee standpoint of forcing someone to mow something down, is that you can't really force them to mow down a whole field to get every last noxious weed. And so the situations I've been involved in some cases there's a judgment call of saying, okay, you need to mow the worst areas and destroy that. But that's an issue. But as far as I know, there's no compensation. County prosecutor knows the whole issue or drags feet so weeds go to seed. Yes. Problems getting county to reimburse townships for their eradication efforts. That's bookkeeping. And then just general communication among everyone involved about who has responsibility for taking care of noxious weeds. Just some other comments which I found interesting. No one seems to know why some weeds are on the list, and I would agree with that. Some noxious weeds are not on the seed law list. We have a separate noxious primary and secondary seed law list, and so this complicates enforcement because if you're not going to keep it on the seed law, which prevents introduction, then it's going to make it difficult to keep noxious weeds out. Not enforced because almost every landowner or government entity has been in violation, and then many of our noxious weeds are so widespread it's not really feasible to manage them per the law. Like poison hemlock falls into this category, mare's tail does. They're essentially everywhere, and so really, how can you basically force one person to use the law when no one else is? That's what I have on this. For more information, you can always go to the Corn newsletter or our website or the Weed Control Guide.